Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Yeah, you may grow to regret that, but it seems okay now. I'm really happy to be here today, genuinely delighted to be here. And I want to thank the principal and the superintendent for inviting me. I've been traveling northern New England for the last 5 years. That's been my job, really. I've been to 250 to 300 middle schools all around New England. I've talked to 90,000 high school and middle school students in rooms just like this and sometimes in gymnasiums. I probably hugged thousands of kids in those schools who've been courageous enough to confide and trust in me. I've been talking about mental health awareness. I'm a baby boomer, not that you could have guessed that. In the world I'm from, the world I grew up in, no one talked about mental health problems. It just wasn't a conversation anyone was willing to have. It was just too awkward to go there. And that didn't help anyone, by the way. Baby boomers did a lot of great things, by the way, that I'm proud of. But in the world of mental health, they were pretty silent. I see that now. And so I've come to your high school today because I need your help. That's why I'm here. That's the only reason I'm here. I want to change the culture and the conversation around mental health and mental wellness in this country. And your generation, by the way, I love your generation. I mean that. You are the least judgmental generation in the history of the United States. You are. You ought to applaud yourself. You are. And if we're going to change the conversation and the culture, you guys are going to have to do it. That's why I'm here. I grew up, by the way, in a very middle-class family. My dad was a high school teacher. My mother wanted to be a nurse, but her family couldn't have afforded that. And my mom worked in an office in the neighboring town. My neighborhood was pretty leafy, but very middle class. My best friend, when I was 10 years old, lived right across the street from my house, and his father was a graduate of MIT. In my childhood, in my neighborhood, MIT was rock star status. My friend's uncle, his father's brother, never finished high school. He was an inpatient at the Danvers Mental Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts. Every adult who ever spoke at that place, and every kid, including me, used to call it the nut house. We must have thought that was funny. Nobody was embarrassed to say that. I certainly wasn't. Looking back all these years later, we all should have been embarrassed. We all should have been ashamed, but we weren't. And I remember as a kid that my friend's uncle would sometimes be picked up by his father at the nut house and brought to their house across the street, usually on a Sunday in the summer for cookout. I was 10. I can still remember that man walking around the yard looking at the flowers. He never looked at me, never gestured to me, never spoke to me. But when he was visiting, I never had the courage to cross that road to play with my friend. I just didn't. And I thought as a kid he must be a one-off. Somehow he was all by himself, because everyone in my town of 20,000 people, I thought, were doing fine with mental health. That wasn't true either, but that's what I believed. And when that guy would leave my neighborhood late on those warm Sunday nights, I felt a sense of relief. I felt safe that he was gone. And I thought they must lock people like him up to keep the rest of us safe. And I knew that I would never know anyone or see anyone the rest of my life who had a mental health problem, because no one in my town did. And I was wrong about that. Some decades later, in a different place, namely Manchester, New Hampshire, and on a street somewhat different than the one I grew up on, mental illness crossed that road from my childhood and took up residence in my own house. It was unseen, unrecognized for what it was, but it was there, and it was growing. I had two sons, 11 and 13. It took up residence in my 13-year-old son. He didn't know he had a mental health problem. Makes sense when you think about it. How would you know that? He thought it was just him. It wasn't just him, but that's what he thought. And my wife and I are both baby boomers. We didn't know anything about mental health. We weren't looking for issues. We wouldn't have spotted them had we been looking. I wish we had been looking. When my son graduated from the 8th grade, it was a Saturday as I recall, he woke up that day and told my wife and I he didn't want to go to his graduation. And we thought it was summer. He was just being lazy. We said, you have to go to your graduation. And so he went, but he wasn't very happy about it. My son started smoking in the 9th grade. He kept that pretty well hidden. We didn't know that. He had friends at Trinity High School in Manchester where he went, but not as many as his younger brother, who was 2 years behind him. My son was a terrific artist, genuinely talented. And he spent a lot of time as a kid in his room with the door closed, drawing. Today I would describe it as withdrawing, but I didn't know much about mental health back then. I know a lot more now. If you look at the yearbook for the year he graduated, you'll find his photograph with all the other graduates. But if you look through the yearbook at the candid shots, football games, dances, you won't see him in those shots because he wasn't at those places. He was probably home drawing or withdrawing. I see that now. My son's really smart, I mean genuinely smart. And he did okay in high school, not as well as he could have, but he always tested pretty well. And he got into a pretty good college in New York, and then off he went. And I don't know if it's true or not. You guys might know this. I hear sometimes when kids go to college, they drink. Have you heard that? Could be true. Sadly, in my son's case, it was true. I didn't know he drank. And back then, he would call me on weekends by telephone, and I could hear it in his voice. It was pretty alarming. And I talked to him about it. He said, Dad, I don't really have a drinking problem. We don't need to talk about it. My wife and I would be on the campus for parents' weekend or other activities, and eventually his friends would seek us out, people I didn't know, to express their concerns about my son's drinking. We'd talk to him about it. He'd say, Dad, I don't know why they say that. I don't drink more than anybody else here. I thought he must have, but I couldn't prove it. I couldn't disprove it. My son got a bachelor's degree. Looking back, knowing what I now know, I'm in awe of him. I have no idea how he did that. He'd done okay in college, not as well as he should have, but he tested well. And he got into a pretty good graduate school in Boston, and then he came home, was living with us, and commuting to the city 3 days a week for his classes. And once he got home, it was pretty clear to us he was drinking pretty much every day. He tried to hide it, tried to disguise it. He really couldn't. It was disturbing to watch it. And we'd talk to him about it. He would say, I don't have a drinking problem. We don't need to keep talking about it. We must have talked about it too much because he moved to Boston for the last 6 months of school, and he got a master's degree. Again, knowing what I know now, he must have willed himself to that degree, but I didn't realize it then. And when he got out with his master's degree, he got a job very quickly, which wasn't surprising. I mean, he's genuinely smart. He's a self-taught musician. He's a terrific artist. He's funny. He's handsome. It wasn't surprising. But it was surprising the job only lasted 6 months. But it wasn't his fault. He said he lost the job. The next job took longer to get and lasted for less time. But it wasn't his fault, he said. He lost the job. And then he was living with us full time, drinking every day, trying to hide it. but it was pretty obvious. And we didn't know what to do. And finally, my wife and I reached out to the alcohol experts, and we told them what I've told all of you here. And they didn't hesitate, by the way. They said, Judge, your son is an alcoholic. That's what's going on here. And you and your wife better deal with that. My wife and I started to go to classes for family members of alcoholics. My son thought that was ridiculous. He said, Dad, I am not an alcoholic. If I didn't have these feelings, I wouldn't be drinking. I told that to the alcohol people. That didn't dissuade them either. Judge, every alcoholic has a reason they drink. Your son's an alcoholic. You and your wife, he told us, are going to have a choice to make. Here it is. You can put your son out of your house, literally out. Hope he hits bottom. I remember that expression from somewhere in my childhood. Hope he hits bottom and turns his life around. Or you can let him stay in your house and he's going to die drinking in your house. Not tomorrow, not next month or next year, but you can't drink like he's drinking and have a long life. And we didn't like those choices. So we persuaded my son, who didn't have a drinking problem, to go to alcohol rehab. He thought that was foolish too, but he went. And then it was like the world tour of alcohol rehab. New Hampshire, Connecticut, Cape Cod, and finally he went to Florida. And my wife and I were praying he'd have some insight about his drinking. And I picked him up several weeks later at Logan Airport in Boston. And on the way to baggage claim, he said, Dad, I had a drink on the plane on the way home, but I don't have a drinking problem. So nothing had taken. And after months more, he would get part-time jobs, hourly rate jobs, nothing appropriate for someone with his degrees. He took graphic design classes wherever he could. He was genuinely talented, always excelled at that. But he couldn't move ahead in his life, and he didn't see what we saw. And so finally, my wife and I, anguished about what we needed to do, and we made the hardest decision we've ever made in our whole life, one I hope nobody here ever has to confront. And we decided we had to put my son out. Seemed like the only choice. It was the hardest decision we ever made and the worst decision we ever could have made. It's like gasoline on a fire. But we put him out. He slept in his car some nights. He slept at the shelter some nights. He ate at the soup kitchen when he was eating. And he continued to drink. I was on the Supreme Court of New Hampshire back then, and I would drive every day from Manchester to Concord, where the court was, on the way up and on the way home, and probably for most of the day, to be honest. I thought we'd failed our son. Somehow we must have failed him. His younger brother had gotten his master's degree, was married, was moving ahead. He was going backwards at 100 miles an hour, and he couldn't see it, and we couldn't stop it. He called us a few times, by the way, from the street. He wanted to come home, and we said no. We said no. But after about 3 weeks of that agony and dreading that phone call, by the way, that no parent ever wants to get, we brought him home. And when he came home, he was drinking as much as he ever had been. Tried to hide it, but he really couldn't. And I think he was fearful that we would put him out again. And he knew he just couldn't go out again. So one night when he was drinking, he assaulted me. I went to the intensive care unit at a Manchester hospital. I was in the ICU for 6 or 8 days. I have no memory of any of that, but my wife does. My master's educated, handsome, funny, talented son was arraigned in a public courtroom in front of a lot of media. Issued an orange jumpsuit and went to the Valley Street Jail in Manchester, which is a place you never want to visit, trust me. But I didn't know that then. It was all over the news in New Hampshire, Massachusetts. There were stories about it in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. My doctors went on the Today Show when I was in the ICU. I didn't know that. My wife did. I don't know how she dealt with all that. She visited my son at Valley Street when I was in the ICU. She said they talked on the telephone with plexiglass between them. He had those orange jumpsuits, his ankles were shackled. She said he was very upset. She said, Mom, I can't believe I did that to Dad. Just tell me he's going to be okay. Just tell me he's going to be okay. In the early days, she didn't know. He said, Mom, they only allow visitors here twice a week, but I can see the corner of the cemetery from my cell. If you went to that street corner on days we agreed on at 3 o'clock, I could at least see you, and I would know my family hadn't abandoned me. Some days my wife would drive from the hospital to that street corner. Late March, early April, pretty dreary. She said I'd park the car, go to the corner by the cemetery, and I'd wave at the jail. It was multi-stories. She said I didn't know what floor, what window, or even if he was looking back. She said I always gave him a thumbs up sign before I left that corner. And she'd drive home, cry all the way home. I didn't know that then. After about 6 or 8 days, I was being wheeled down a corridor at the hospital. It's the first time I knew I was in the hospital. I said to the fellow who was pushing me, what am I doing here? He said, I think you fell, Judge. I felt pretty sore for someone who'd fallen, but I had no memory of any other problems. So I just accepted what he told me. And they brought me to this room, a large room on the top floor. And by the way, when you visit people in the hospital, try not to say, I love your room, okay? Try not to say things like, I hated my room. But people told me they loved it. After a day and a half, my wife and I were finally alone. No nurses, no doctors. And she told me, as best she knew, what had happened, and I hadn't fallen. And she told me where my son was, and we just cried. I've been a judge or a lawyer my entire professional life, so I knew what it meant for him, for us, maybe even for his brother. I didn't understand it. My thought was, alcohol, when it's abused, can take people to bad places. I don't know the dictionary definition of hopelessness, but I know what it feels like. It's exactly what it feels like. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't go home with my wife. I couldn't speak to my son. The nights were endless in that hospital. Thank God for nurses. I love nurses. When I was finally released from the hospital, I wasn't allowed to visit my son at the jail. The court wouldn't allow it. So I didn't see him for 6 months. My wife would go twice a week and go to the street corner on other days. Finally, friends would take her place who had known my son since he was little. But I didn't see him for 6 months. And the day I saw him was in a basement windowless courtroom in the center of Manchester, where he was about to be sentenced to the state prison. I hope you don't have that day in your life. I would have bet you everything I owned or did or might ever do that could never be my family. It was on that morning. He came in through a side door with a bailiff at his elbow. My wife and I are in the front row, public section behind the rail, still a fair amount of press, still a story to somebody. And he came in, he looked great, by the way. He hadn't had a drink in 6 months. He was wearing civilian clothing. I wouldn't see that again for a long time. And I stood up and he walked over to me and gave me a big hug. He said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did that. Can you ever forgive me? I said to him that morning, if you don't quit, your mother and I won't quit. He said, I won't quit, Dad. He was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years in the state prison. I don't know how we all didn't pass out. I don't know how he didn't pass out. The court suspended 3 of those years, or 4 of those years. He'd served 6 months, but he was definitely going away for 3 years. And then off he went. That was a long ride home that day. They don't allow you to visit new inmates for 30 days. They assess every new inmate. What are the issues? Where should they be housed on the prison campus? But we were eventually invited up because my son allowed it. And we met in the secure psychiatric unit of the state prison. My son was not housed there, but that's where the meeting took place. Kind of an anesthetic, sterile feeling place. And we met in the large conference room. My son was there. The head psychiatrist started out the meeting and said, I really like your son. You know, I've gotten to know him. He's really smart. I said, no, I know that, but we're in the prison here, doctor. He said, I know that. He said, let me tell you what's going on with him. Your son has really serious depression. He has panic attacks, that feeling you're about to die. And anxiety, which the psychiatrist described as virtually off the charts. He said that's why he was drinking, Judge. It was the only relief he could find. It wasn't a good choice, he said, don't get me wrong, but it made sense to him. But the more he drank, the more he needed to drink. He was self-medicating his mental health problems. And when he told us that in that place, I knew we had failed him. I was, after all, the parent. I should have known something about mental health. I didn't. I thought all mental health problems were basically hopeless. They're far from hopeless. I know that now. I know that treatment works now. I didn't then. He said, we're going to try to work with his son and see if we can turn his life around. He has every life skill you need to be successful. We'd visit twice a week. After 4 months, he came out one night, hugged us as he always did. He said, Dad, I feel so different. I said, what do you mean different? He said, I'm sleeping through the night, Dad. I haven't done that since I was really young. I can focus, Dad. My mind's not racing. I'm teaching at the prison, he said. I said, what are they doing for you? He said, I see a counselor here, Dad. That's really helpful. I take medication at night and in the morning. It's changed my whole life, Dad. And when he told us that, I knew we had failed him. You don't want to find out in the state prison about mental health problems. That's not the point where you should learn them. I was on the Supreme Court at the time. I became Chief Justice while he was in the state prison. You might imagine I was not real popular at the prison. And if your child is staying there 24/7 with the very people whose appeals you're reviewing, that'll keep you up at night. My son was very brave about it. He said, Dad, you worked too hard for that job. Don't quit. If it gets better, I'll tell you, but don't quit. He never complained. After 3 years, he was up for parole, and he deserved parole, but I said, I was Chief Justice. I said, they won't parole you. It's going to look like they're favoring the judge's son. And they paroled him. I'm grateful to them. After a year on parole, the parole officer said, why are you on parole? He said, well, that's what's required. He said, you're the best person I've ever had on parole. I'm going to try to get it eliminated. My son was excited about that. I said, it probably won't happen. They eliminated his parole. My son, who was drinking every day for years, has not had a drop of alcohol in over 15 years. He said, Dad, I'm not that guy anymore. I don't have that tug anymore, Dad. I could spend a night in a liquor store. I wouldn't drink. So why am I bothering all of you? I am the last guy on earth to be doing this. It's become the most important work of my life. I would speak every day if I could, because I see it now. In the aftermath of my son's incarceration, people would come up to me, especially during the first 6 or 8 months. They'd recognize my face from the paper. They'd say, hey, you're looking good, Judge. I knew what they meant. I said, thank you, my son's doing better now. Oh, I didn't want to ask you about your son. I said, that's okay, he had mental health issues. We just saw alcohol. And then every one of those people, every single one, would then open up about their mother, their father, their cousin, their aunt, their child, or themselves, and mental health problems. And I went home, I said to my wife, we thought we were alone down there in the Valley of Mental Illness. There were a lot of families down there, we just never saw them. But I didn't do anything. I'm a baby boomer, we don't talk about it. 6 years ago, I got involved in a campaign that brings me to your high school today. It's a product of a genius, of a psychologist in Maryland, a woman. She was on Time Magazine's 100 list in 2012, the 100 most influential people on the planet Earth. She was on that list. It was very impressive. It's the kind of list that Nelson Mandela used to show up on. She wanted to launch this campaign to let people know the 5 most common signs of mental illness. They're not diagnostic, but it's hard to have a mental health problem without having one or more of these symptoms. And she wanted New Hampshire to be the first state. She wanted people to know the signs and symptoms of mental illness. Like most of you now know the signs of a heart attack or a stroke. And you didn't go to medical school, neither did I, but I know a lot of them. Why is that? We must have thought it was important. We must have thought it would save lives if we knew them. We launched this nonpartisan, non-political awareness campaign in the New Hampshire State House in the House Chamber, May 23rd, 2016, on a Monday morning at 10 a.m., a workday. The New Hampshire House has 400 seats, just like these. There are 400 state reps in my small state. I was worried no one would show up on a Monday morning at 10. When I got there that morning, there were 425 people in that chamber. People were in the balcony, too. Every member of our congressional delegation, our governor, the Attorney General, 3 members of the Supreme Court, the Catholic bishop, the Episcopal Church, the Jewish community, educators, law enforcement, mental health people, families. It was the single most impressive room I'd ever seen assembled in 4 decades in New Hampshire. And Barbara Van Dalen, the genius behind this, stood up that morning in that room and asked this question. Does anyone in this chamber, she said, who's been untouched by mental health problems, yourself, your family, your friends, your co-workers, raise your hand, she said. I had no idea what to expect, so I was scanning the room to get a rough count. Not one hand went up. Not one hand went up, meaning every single person in that room had been affected. I said to her later, Barbara, how's that possible? She said, John, it happens in virtually every room where I ask the question. Just because people don't talk about it, John, doesn't mean families aren't dealing with it. She was right about that. After that launch, which exceeded our expectations, we didn't have a game plan. We hadn't done this before. No other state had done it. So we waited to see if anyone would ask us to speak anywhere. In the last 5 years, I've spoken 660 times, and I invite myself nowhere. Not about me, by the way. It's about this. In the last 5 years, I've been to more high schools and middle schools talking to students than anybody on the planet Earth. It has so opened my eyes and made me realize that we need a community-wide conversation about mental health. We need to stop hiding it and shaming people and stigmatizing it. It's a health issue, not a character flaw, not a personal weakness. One of the first schools I remember going to was right outside of Concord, New Hampshire. It was 9 a.m. I spoke to 840 students, grades 9 through 12, in the gymnasium with the high ceilings and no acoustics. I was on a 6-inch riser onto one of the basketball nets behind a fixed podium with a gooseneck microphone. The students were on the bleachers, nobody on the floor. And as I looked out at them that day, I thought, they're probably saying, whose grandfather is this guy and why is he bothering us? I wasn't optimistic. I spoke to them that day as I've spoken to you here. I wasn't sure they could hear me, or whether they would care if they heard me or not. And when I finished speaking, it was dead silence. It looked like an oil painting, and it was really awkward. And the principal, who was up against the wall, stepped up on the little riser, shook my hand, thanked me for coming. Dead silence. And I was thinking, they don't care about it, or they couldn't hear me, or both. I thought the campaign would end there that morning. And after about 3 or 4 seconds, which seemed like 3 or 4 minutes, and almost all at once, 840 students stood up on both sides of that gym, started whistling and applauding, and they did that for almost a minute. The principal said, "I'm shocked by this." I said, "You're shocked." I said, "They're not applauding me, I know that. Not about me, but it's about this topic." I said, "You know what they're saying? They're saying, I agree with that guy. Why aren't we talking about it? Why aren't we doing something about it?" That's what their applause means. A few weeks later, I was at a much larger gym in central New Hampshire. The bleachers went to the ceiling. I was in the middle of the floor with a handheld mic. There were kids on both sides. Same thing happened. And then, for the first time, students started to approach me and confide in me. This man they'd never met, but they knew I wouldn't shame them or blame them. I saw this guy walking towards me. He looked like Rob Gronkowski. He was a big guy. Had long hair and a baseball cap on backwards. He got about 2 feet from my face. His eyes were wet. He said, "Can I ask you a favor?" I said, "Sure, what?" He said, "Can I give you a hug?" I said to him, "You're 6'3". "Sure, hug away." Started hugging me, this guy. And then he opened up about his own story. And I remember thinking, oh my God. I said to him, "You may be the bravest guy I'm going to meet in my entire life. Can I return the hug?" He said, "I'd love that." I was hugging this linebacker in a high school gym. I don't remember his name, and I'll never see him again. He was in pain. He wanted to tell someone. That's been repeated in different ways for the last 5 years. And I'm growing impatient about change. We need to change it. And I know, statistically, 1 in 5 adolescents will have a mental health problem. 1 in 5 adults will too. Half of all mental illness in America begins by age 14. Most of it's highly treatable. 2/3 begins by age 23. Why do we tolerate that? Why do we tolerate the fact we don't have a mental health system in this country? It used to be that way for breast cancer, by the way. Thank God it's not now. It used to be that way for HIV/AIDS. It's not now. It's still that way with mental health. And I'm banking on your generation to change that. And if you won't do it for yourself, do it for someone here, someone you know who's got a mental health issue, someone at home, some family member, or some friend. Silence is not our friend. Change requires awkward moments. We need a lot of awkward moments. And your generation is up to the task. I mean that. I really admire you. I've met so many of you, not here, but your peers around New England. Let me finish with this. What I'm trying to do is change the culture and the conversation, because we need to. We've never done it, and we should do it. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens, some of them under the age of 14, are suffering and hiding. I was speaking to the principal today, and she told me about the mental health access in this school, which is remarkable, by the way. Remarkable what they're doing in this school. That's not happening in most schools. So I want to change the conversation, the culture. And you could say to me, it's really hard to change the culture. We can't do that. And it's as hard as you want to make it, by the way. When I was a kid, 100 years ago. Everyone smoked in my childhood. Everyone smoked. My dad was a teacher. He must have been paid on Thursdays and felt flush with cash on Thursday nights. So my sister, my mother, and I would get in his car, that blue Impala, he loved that car, and we'd drive to the local restaurant in our town. And every single table in that restaurant had an ashtray. Some had two, by the way. At some point during the evening, every table in that restaurant was smoking. My parents loved my sister and myself as they blew smoke in our face across the table. And after 2 hours in that smoke chamber, cleverly disguised as a restaurant, we get back in my dad's car to drive home 2 miles. My mother and father, one of them at least, would light up. 2 miles is probably a long trip if you're a smoker. My mother would crack the window. I was in the back seat. Didn't seem to filter out very well if you're in the back seat. And then we get to my house, and every room in my house had an ashtray. The only rooms in my house that didn't have ashtrays were the bathrooms. Every teacher's lounge in every high school in the United States had ashtrays. Every principal's office, every church basement, every town hall, every automobile. They were everywhere. I couldn't wait to be old enough to smoke. Have you seen an ashtray recently? What happened to them? Something changed. Something changed. When I was a kid, racism was not only tolerated in many places, it was applauded in many places. That's a childhood I remember. I remember watching the news one night with my mother on the black and white television set, and I saw African Americans dressed like I am now, being beaten by police officers, attacked by police dogs. It was very alarming to watch it. I said to my mother, "Where's that happening?" She wasn't proud of it. It's happening in the United States. If you had said to me at that childhood age, after that broadcast, "John, do you think in your lifetime we will elect an African-American president of the United States of America?" I would have said, "I'll bet you my ashtray that never happens." Thank you, Barack Obama. I never met Senator Obama when he was running. I was Chief Justice in New Hampshire then. And my mother had passed by the time he was elected, but her voice remained. And she said to me that night when he was appearing in Grand Park in Chicago, "You better go down to that inaugural. This is historic. This hasn't happened in 232 years." My mother would have gone. My mother would have thumbed a ride to get there. So I bought an airline ticket and I flew to Washington. I wanted to see history live. And I stood there that morning in January with 1.4 million of my closest friends on the mall. Obama, from where I was standing, looked like he was 2 inches tall. So I watched it mostly on the Jumbotron where he was 12 feet tall. In less than a minute, after 232 years, Barack Hussein Obama, with the funny name and the black face, was sworn in as President of the United States of America and leader of the free world. Something changed. If we can eliminate ashtrays from the world I grew up in, if we can elect an African-American president for 2 terms, from the childhood I remember, we can do this. We can learn the 5 basic signs of mental illness and start a conversation that has not existed in this country since it was founded. We can do everything in our power to take away the shame and the stigma and the shadows. And we can get about building a mental health system in this country so that your children will have access when they need it, because we need to do it. I've been doing this for so long, sometimes I feel maybe I'm on a fool's errand. Maybe I'm the only one that cares about it. And then you have a moment like I had at a middle school where the kids listened to me, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. They listened. If I were talking about the law, their eyes would have glazed over. Talking about mental health, they pay attention. They know what I'm saying is true. And when they were leaving the gym that day, kids were saying, I loved your speech, awesome speech. These are 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids. And finally, a little boy came up, and he thanked me for coming. And he said, I want to thank you for being at my school today and talking about this. I said, you're very welcome. I was happy to come. He said, I want to tell you why I'm thanking you. I said, sure, why? He said, they tell me here at school that I'm on the spectrum myself. And your talk here today, he said, has changed my entire life. He said, can I give you a hug? He started hugging me, this little boy who was crying. And my eyes watered. I hadn't changed his whole life, I know that. But I'll bet you for the first time in his young life, he wasn't afraid or ashamed to tell someone he didn't know what his challenges were. That young boy should be able to tell anyone and get the hug he needed and the help he deserves. We're not there yet. And unless your generation takes this up as a cause, my generation didn't. Your parents' generation hasn't. You could. Anyway, listen, thank you. I appreciate your help, and I appreciate your attention. I brought a lot of these cards. The principal will decide how best to get those out to you, but I hope you take it home. I hope you put it on your refrigerator door, and I hope it starts a conversation that's not going on in many households in this country. Anyway, thanks very much.